Our next presentation is entitled From Permanent to Portable, A Chinese Stele's Journey from a Garden in Maine to the MFA. Pamela Hatchfield is the Robert P. and Carol T. Henderson Head of Objects Conservation Emerita at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She is additionally the 2023 Judith Pratzker Distinguished Professor of Conservation and Technical Studies at New York University. She also serves as the project coordinator for Held Trust, a collaboration between the National Endowments for Humanities and the Foundation for the Advancement in Conservation that charts the future of preservation and conservation in the United States. Pam has also co-developed Climate Resilience Resources for Cultural Heritage, a suite of free resources to plan for and respond to climate change impacts. Additionally, she is the fellow of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, the International Institute for Conservation, and the American Academy in Rome. Pam?
Good afternoon, everybody. I am so delighted to be here with all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to present with my wonderful former and present colleagues. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. I wanted to give a huge shout out to Kei Satomi before we start, who is the unsung hero of this entire production, and I know she's probably working on 1,000 other brand new projects, but I'm always amazed at how she manages to get everything so seamlessly and beautifully organized and make it look like it's everybody else's success. So thank you, Kay, and thank you to the AV team who are here today with us. So I wanted to start with, this is a bit of a different scale. I wanted to start with this beautiful work in the middle of a forest. In 1926, landscape architect designer Beatrix Farrand designed a garden on Mount Desert Island in Maine for John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, which incorporated Asian sculpture in a rich and varied landscape. Chinese sandstone votive stele, dated 576 AD, was featured at a key site overlooking Little Long Pond in this garden. We had been promised some of these objects, and that's another long story I won't get into today, but this was one of them, and we had become increasingly concerned about its condition over our many visits to Mount Desert Island to check on its condition. So this was to be bequeathed to the MFA upon the death of David Rockefeller, who was the youngest child of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And he actually died in 2017, but as far as we knew in 2015, it looked like he was going to outlive this sculpture. So before we get to that, we're going to just give you a little sense of orientation. Here we are on Mount Desert Island, and here is the location. You can just see Little Long Pond here. You get a sense of the fact that this garden is out there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, marine environment subject to extremes of temperature, humidity, rain, and snow. And here you see the plan of the garden with the stele at the furthest most northwest corner right here. And I think you can get a sense of the fact that this huge garden is filled with moss and stones and steps and all kinds of things in the way. So here is another slide just to give you a little sense of the garden. It looks like this, with pink walls and yellow roof tiles inspired by the Forbidden Palace in China, where the Rockefellers were inspired to collect Asian garden sculpture. You don't see much of the sculpture in this photo, but there are actually about 40 pieces throughout the garden. So here is the stele at the very end of what is called the Spirit Path, which is lined with 17th to 18th century Korean figures made out of granite. I just wanted to show you the stele in the garden prior to its removal, and I think you can get a sense of the lush environment teeming with biology. You see lichens and moss on the sculpture, and we don't know whether anything would have happened had this piece not suddenly fallen off and turned to dust, according to the staff at the garden. And it was this that convinced David Rockefeller that he should think about letting us move this inside before the original terms of the bequest. So how the heck were we going to get this thing out of the garden? We had no idea how it was secured to its base. And, this base, by the way, had been applied in the 1920s. Originally, in China, it probably would have just been buried in earth up to about here. So that was definitely added in the 1920s before it was installed in the garden. We weren't sure how the base had been set on the stones it was sitting on. We were very concerned, as I mentioned, with its very fragile condition, and we had no information about the structure on the inside of this and how it was attached to the base. The only thing that we could see was that there had been some previous attempts to try and address some delamination along the bedding planes of the stone of the stele by adding mortar. We did not want to stress this stone any more than we needed to, so we decided we were going to have to try to take it out of the garden in an upright position. And you can see here some of the challenges: the narrow space, the moss, the uneven steps, and the very uneven footing, gravel paths, and grass, and so on, with not much clearance. So before we attempted to move it, we did a lot of consolidation or strengthening and facing of the surface, in especially fragile areas. The white patches are squares of Japanese tissue applied to support broken areas during transport. You can see the paving stones around the base here, and the beginnings of the scaffolding that was built, and also some supporting lumber that was put in to level it, and the beginnings of a ramp that I'll talk about in a minute to help us get this down the steps. So we'd been told that there was a concrete base, a footing underneath these stones, but we honestly had no idea how it was attached or what that footing looked like. There was no documentation. So Addie Lutts and Dante Vallance worked on this amazing structure. They basically constructed a lifting cage using unistrut, and I don't know, nobody else has mentioned unistrut, but I'm sure many of you have worked with it and know about it. And this was intended to be incredibly versatile and flexible, and to be able to be transformed for a variety of operations, lifting, moving, sort of like the Mountmakers version of a Batmobile. They added a gimbaled frame, which is this part, or at least a temporary gimbaled frame, which would keep the stele perpendicular to the ground, because we did not know how. We knew we were coming over a lot of very uneven ground, but we didn't know what kind of stress we might put on this object if we were to attempt to lie it down. So we decided this would be a method to keep it upright. The unistrut, I'm a huge fan, like erector sets, if any of you played with those in your youth. I'm sure Dante did a lot. You can make pretty much anything out of it. It allowed us to remove and replace supports whenever we needed access to specific areas or wanted to include bracing at particular locations. And one of the things I laugh about as a conservator, we all laughed about actually, was that I told Dante that among the many challenges in moving this thing, he was not allowed to touch the surface at all. So there were a few areas in the end, you'll see in a minute, that we allowed the surface to be braced at. It also allowed us to secure a couple of garden carts together, which we used to move the stele and put it in the truck for transport. And then when the gimbal mechanism was no longer needed, it could be removed. And then you'll see later we could attach other supports and or wheels for getting it around the gallery, and finally, in the end, a steel support plate that would allow it ultimate flexibility whenever we were moving it for storage or for display. And on the right-hand side, you can see the thrust bearing, which is here, and the pivot plates, and I think this is the sort of thing that was used. Please don't ask me too much about it, because Dante did not give me much in the way of specific details, but if we need to get a hold of him, I'm sure we can. So the Stele and the base combined weight was about 1,100 pounds, plus the lifting frame and the gimbal assembly. So at its heaviest, the entire package would have been about 1,500 pounds. And 3/4-inch bolts were used to act as the pivot points with these two triangular frames of unistrut, which, as I said, were bolted to the garden carts for transport. So on the left, you see Addie and Matthew Siegal assembling the cage around the Stele, which was wrapped in Teflon to protect the surface after consolidation. And here is one of those places we said was okay to put bracing. So there's a wooden block which could be adjusted tighter or looser with these threaded bolts, and Volara surface that's covered again with Teflon. And then all these X's were places where we said nobody could touch the surface, so those were left completely unsupported. So here they are constructing the lifting cage around the Stele, and then here we are starting to try. Oh no, I guess we're just still assembling the I-beam and the chain fall, and you see this is the beginnings of that ramp being built. We were pretty concerned. We tried to lift this, and Dante had really hoped that the whole thing would just kind of lift off a dry-fitted pin, but alas, that did not happen. We got up to about 2,000 pounds, and we knew we were in trouble. We didn't want to exert any greater pressure on it for fear that if the pins did release, the Stele could spring up at great hazard, and we don't want to put that kind of stress on. So next, we opted for, so we started with these wooden wedges and trying to pull this up with the chain fall, and we moved very quickly into the land of the bigger hammer. We removed the paving stones and excavated around the base, revealing this concrete footing. And here, in retrospect, in what seems like a charmingly naive and hopeful attempt, one of the garden staff is using his cute little sawzall to try to get through this. That did not go very well. Finally, eventually, after much gnashing of teeth and renting of garments, we decided to resort to the much, much bigger hammer. And we ended up using this concrete saw, chisel, and hammer. It turned out that the Stele had been epoxied in place, and in the end, the underside, part of the underside of the base broke away with the epoxy. And here you see the laborious efforts that were made trying to chisel out this using the concrete saw and then a chisel and hammer to get rid of the concrete and free the bottom. And there was a lot of joy when this was finally separated from the concrete base without damaging the Stele. So on the left, you see our beautiful, fancy garden carts with the big fat wheels that could travel over all of this terrain, cobbled together using unistrut again as a base for the Stele. And here the Stele is freed finally, and supported up here by the chain fall, and is being moved on to the garden carts. Here we are now moving through the garden after we had finally cut through all of this, and there were two brass pins underneath, but they had also been epoxied in, and there was a lot of epoxy on the base, as I had mentioned. So you can see us moving the Stele now through the garden on a variety of plywood ramps, and these are guidelines that we attached to make sure that we had control of the object at all times. I think there were about 10 or 12 of us in all moving this sculpture. Finally, as day turned to night, it was 8 o'clock by the time we finally got this onto the truck. and it was a happy night. And as you can see, we had absolutely just millimeters of space to in height to get it on the truck, so there was no sweat there at all. Okay, there it is on the truck, being secured on a pallet, so it could be moved with a pallet jack. And here you see it once it reached the museum, and that was a happy day, and we took the Teflon off, and it's still got all of its facings in place here, and it's on a little wooden pallet. And then we attached outriggers and wheels, and we could just take this thing for a joyride around the museum, and that was pretty great. Very happy about that. So we then decided we had actually not just decided, we planned this whole thing out very carefully, but we needed to level the base. The base was very uneven because of the epoxy and other old plaster that had been applied to the base. So we needed to work upside down in order to get all of that removed and leveled. So rule number 1, never epoxy your Stele to the floor of the garden. Just take a note. Dante, so here we are, I'm removing some of the plaster from the underside and some of the residual epoxy from the underside. And then Dante and Addie are drilling pins because we decided we needed to use knurled inserts like this to put into the base of the sculpture, and then these would have threaded bolts coming up to secure them, and so we could adjust those to the surface of the bottom of the steel plate. We also were going to put an HDPE pad directly underneath, and there you see it attached to the steel plate that was going to form its permanent base. This is just a piece of plexi that we put some holes in to accommodate the old pin, and then these new knurled bolts that are going into, rather knurled inserts that are going, the bolts are going into. So we wanted to make sure that we had a level surface, so we supported the sculpture as much as possible once we put it on here. So that's just a dry fit. And then here we are putting a first layer of plaster, which was bulked with CM bond adhesive to make it stronger. And we applied the plaster once, and then you see that drying just upside down, and then twice again, or once more again, to get a nice even surface. And this was isolated with a piece of coated mylar, silicone-coated mylar, just so that the plaster wouldn't stick to the plexi. So then here we are now with the plate in place, and we still have all of this space underneath. You can see, by the way, that the wheels of the chariot have been removed, and we're just using these outriggers to support it. And then the happy day when we started to remove the cage, the unistrut cage, and you see that the base is in place. And here you can just barely see the return where the shadow hides the HDPE so that we could get a deck around there if we needed to or when we need to. And it is easily transportable using a pallet jack. So it's freestanding at that point. Now, because there's been so much cool stuff shown here today about scanning and CNC milling, I hadn't had this slide in, but I just thought I would add to this very briefly. We ended up making a replica in sandstone of this object for the original location in Mount Desert Island. And this is the structured light scanner that was used, and you see it's on a lift because we had to get all the way up and over so that we could scan all parts of this. It was an aerospace engineering company that came up to do that for us, so we have a very, very high level of resolution. That was translated into a toolpath, and a 5-axis robot carved this for us, and you see it working here. And then I just show you Dante's designs for the reinstallation of the replica so that you can see that he's using sleeves and pins that will be removable in the future. So thank you all so much. This is wonderful. There's a lot more to the story, but for the mount making portion, here we are. Thank you.
So I have a question, Pam. I think you said that the base that's on the bottom is not original to the piece. Do we know how that's attached? Or I think you said, did you say 1920? Or what, do we not know the date that they were joined?
It was probably before they bought it, or perhaps they bought it and then the dealer, Yamanaka, who actually sold this museum, many other museums, a lot of incredible Asian art, sold this to them, and he may have added it. It may have been added in China sometime in the 1920s. We have no information, but it would definitely not have been the original mounting for the object.
Would you be able to explain the process of cladding the outside in the white little sheets of paper? Was that meant to kind of stabilize really loose pieces, or was that to indicate like just an area that could be problematic during
Do you mean
transport?
the little squares of tissue?
Yeah, yeah.
We applied those there had been a lot of treatment of this beforehand because it was so friable. So a variety of different treatments had been done previously, including silanes, and we used B72 to do some consolidation and then also to secure those areas because the stone was literally falling apart. It was falling off. So it was delaminating. So we applied those squares to secure them during transport, and once they were here, once it arrived here, we spent a long time removing those squares, and Eve Mayberger can attest to that. She's here today.
Is that something you were really, I mean, I know that in transport we can always be really nervous about loss like that. With the drilling, were you concerned about vibration too, like losing any of those pieces?
Yes, we were terrified.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
When you have an object like this where the base is not part of the original object but was added long before the museum obtained it, who makes the decision and how do you make the decision about whether you're comfortable plastering or drilling into or attaching things to that base that's been there since the original purchase of the object?
We talked about this at great length with the curatorial staff and explored all the options ourselves. And, if a curator someday wants to display this as was originally intended, without a base on it at all, but kind of appearing to be buried in earth, there would be a way to do that. But given the fragility of the Stele and the lack of knowledge that we had about how it was secured, we were not anxious to remove the base, and we also decided that because the base was later and because we needed to have a way to move this around, this would be the least invasive method for securing it and stabilizing it. So it was definitely a trade-off, but it was discussed at tremendous length.
Thank you, Pam.